let's see, there are 6 of us. We have a full dais, so I am calling the City Council to order.
And we have just had a brief P&Z meeting, so I know we do have a quorum. I'm calling this special meeting to order.
Fantastic. Mr. Jones, will we turn it over to you?
Thank you, Mayor and Chair. So this is to go over the recommendations to date that the P&Z has spent the last couple of months working on as a group. I'll say we had some lively conversations, some more energetic than others. A lot of good discussions went into it, a lot of good thought. And my hat's off to them for going to the level of detail that they did on some of this. Much like council has in the past, they took their time and did their homework, and it was good to walk through there. So just to give you an update, or where we were and where we started. So these were the 9 topic areas from your last joint work session that you all asked P&Z to take a look at. It's permitted use charts, community value nuisances, accessory dwelling units, tree preservation, street sections, signage, applications and checklists, the development flow chart, and then parking. So we'll just kind of skim through these, and we had a discussion at the last P&Z to kind of go over their recommendations and make sure that staff had some clarity on that. And so with that, we will begin going through these individually. And please, P&Z, feel free to chime in, and council, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt at any time. So the permitted use charts. This was a very big topic of conversation. You can imagine going from 290 permitted uses currently to not having a permitted use chart in the new Bastrop codes is just different. And so we had a lot of good conversation on this. This is where we spend a lot of time talking about nuisances and how we will regulate nuisances going forward. And the main thing that we kept going back to is, if you can't hear it, smell it, see it, and other things, does it really matter what you're doing with that property? And it goes back to that public and private realm. You know, we care greatly about what happens in the public realm, but in the private side, as long as you're not creating a nuisance to your neighbor, does it really matter? And so at the end of the day, P&Z as unanimously really came up with or landed on the fact that as long as it's not a nuisance, we don't need permitted use charts. We will have some prohibited use charts, and then in certain districts, you'll have things that are not allowed, and then in certain districts, or place types rather, you will have some uses. And so I'll just kind of go through those. So we talked about sexually oriented businesses, and on that they landed that those should be allowed only in the employment center districts with the allowance of a conditional use permit. We had some discussions on smoke shops, particularly where those may or may not.
Matt, can I ask a question?
Yes,
I have
ma'am.
2 questions already. One is really for Alan. Is there an actual definition of sexually oriented businesses, a legal definition of that? Great. So it's one of those, you know it when you see it? So there's really not anything, it is what it is, and we move on. Anybody want to take that job on? I feel like that's something we ought to have a discussion about, because I think when we read that, we all have our own opinion of what we think is included in that. So that was my first. And then the second question, we're talking about place types, and I totally understand that, and the restrictions per place types. Did P&Z discuss, can we also have differentiation by districts if we so choose at some time? Because I understand that we can. Right?
Yeah, we talked about that.
But what we did first time around was just place types, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, some would be appropriate in place types, and then some character districts. For instance, you wouldn't have any like industrial uses, you would not have in the downtown character district. So anything on the last page of the permitted use charts under industrial and warehousing would not be appropriate in like the downtown, for example.
I had a question. Alan, could we use this definition under the local government code for sexually oriented businesses? Could we use that? That could be a basis for it, but okay. And I'm just wondering if it would be easy, instead of defining it for ourselves, if this one worked, we could just reference it like we've done with several other sections, so we're not writing a bunch of new stuff.
Yeah, I just think that's a to-do item. Council, any comments on that?
I totally agree. We've defined a lot of other things in here, and to have not defined that seems like an omission.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Fine. So, for example, you were talking about districts and place types. So the industrial and manufacturing uses would only be allowed per their recommendation in that employment center place type, but you have employment center place types in a lot of different character districts. So you would then need to define what character districts those would not be appropriate, because you'll still have a P5 or the employment center place type, but you might not want that place type or those uses allowed in every district.
In that in
character
a particular
district.
district.
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
Yeah.
So we did talk about that.
Okay.
And the industrial and manufacturing uses were one of those things that they talked about. They also discussed having conditional use permits for your breweries and wineries, etc., similar to we do today. So not necessarily a restaurant that's has alcohol sales, but a true bar, winery, and or brewery. They thought it would be appropriate to have a CUP with that in any place type. We did talk about employment centers because that was something that was relatively, it hasn't always been with us in all of the discussions. It was something that was added to the code to address economic development opportunities. So we did have conversations on those and where those may or may not be appropriate. At the end of the day, they felt that they were needed, absolutely. And so, but they really were tying more like warehousing and different classes of office types that you would see in those employment centers. But we had a discussion on them, and they saw that it was appropriate to use and to have going forward. We did talk about that there's a list, and this probably ties back into the SOB discussion, about the need to have a discussion about federally and or state regulated uses. There's certain things you can and cannot do, and so we'll probably tie that conversation with our city attorney into the discussion on SOBs, because we certainly want to be following the law, and when necessary we can just defer back to that. So that was one thing that they recommended. And then in permitted uses, we also talked about compatibility and building setbacks. And the discussion was had whether or not you should have mandatory setbacks within your land uses, or just even a compatibility setback. So if you have a single-family residence next to an office, for example, you have a special setback for that relationship in that place type that would be a compatibility setback. And so we kind of went around on that, and we talked about, well, the building codes, the I codes will regulate setbacks, so any life safety concern will be regulated through that. And then at the end of the day, we pointed back to nuisances again, and we said, well, if you can't see it, smell it, hear it, and it's not bothering anybody and or your neighbor, is it necessary to put all these regulations into the code again when what we're trying to do is pull them out? And so ultimately they decided that that was the answer, that again we'll regulate by nuisance and we'll regulate by the I codes and life and safe life safety and health.
I do have something I want.
Oh, yeah.
I do have something I wanted to add to that. I think that's makes a lot of sense from a plan when you're looking at it from a bird's eye view. My issue more was with an elevation. You could have a situation where you have a smaller house next to a much larger house, or a larger, maybe a P between a P3 and a P4. There could be a situation where you would have an out of scale scenario looking at it in elevation. So I drew something up, and I know I emailed it to Matt, but I don't know if that's out there. But the City of Austin, and I know I'm using the City of Austin, but the City of Austin has tackled this with what they call a tent. So they do this so that there is this scale is considered in a neighborhood, so you would never have a situation where, or you won't have a situation where you'd have a much larger house next to a smaller house. That's become known as the McMansion Ordinance. And the reason they did that is because by ordinance before this, they could actually do that. There was no compatibility setback really at all, so they were right up there because the building code, the IBC, is really directed at fire and the spread of fire, so you only have to be 10 feet away. So you could have within 10 feet a 3-story structure next to a 1-story structure. So that was my concern. I know I expressed, I don't think I drew anything at the time, but I think when you see it in elevation, that might make people think. So the way it was addressed, at least in the City of Austin, was to come up with what they call a tent, and I think that's a smart way to do it. We don't have any language like that, so you could potentially have a scenario where you have a much larger home or a much larger building of any kind and I'm very much behind, having these strong building types, but you could have a situation with an out of scale buildings next to each other.
So, Pablo and Matt, I may reference you. I can think of 4 streets I can drive on right now that have big houses next to little big houses in Bastrop.
It's all over downtown.
And we seem to have survived. So, Councilmember Jackson, did you want to make a comment?
No, I was going to comment also that, a few years ago when I was on council, we had that issue with a house that was being subdivided. The house next door was so much larger than that one, and the way it was subdivided from that house, it had been an accessory building, and it's on Farm Street. I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but it overshadowed the house next door, and the neighbors were a little concerned because of the size of that house next door to the smaller house, and so it's something that is rampant, I guess you could say, in the downtown area.
Councilmember Ennis?
What we were trying to do when form-based code came in was define the setbacks rather than the size of the structures. As I understand form-based code, the chairman might correct me on this, but or chairwoman, excuse me. I just don't see that being a problem. Size next to each other.
Matt, one thing, I thought 3 stories was not allowed in every single place type, correct?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
So there wouldn't be someone would have to get a zoning change to be able to do, I guess you could approve a P5 right next to a P2 or something, but if they're all P3, you're not going to have a 3-story next to a 1-story. Is that right?
It's possible that a 2.5-story would be allowed under P3.
So 2-story in an attic, right?
Yes, ma'am. And so the hope is that you do get the intermingling of different building types, building forms on the lot. And the compatibility ordinance in Austin is extremely complicated, and it has some reverse effects at times where I believe that we've resolved this because we've created a movable envelope with the style of the code that we've written. The building can move around on the lot based on the lot dimensions and the parameters. I'm hopeful that we've resolved this issue, and as development occurs, people can be, dare I say, neighborly and be mindful of the existing environment. But compatibility, if the council did go that direction, I'd seriously advise against the City of Austin's compatibility ordinance in the current state.
And I know that we're looking forward, and I appreciate that. But and I would be happy to hear from all of. And I understand Pablo's got a great perspective, and he's talking about the elevations. But looking backwards, I'm thinking I can walk down the street, and there's big houses and little houses, and that is a part of our DNA, and maybe I'm misinformed. Cheryl, do you?
Right, and when we first started out with this whole thing, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that's kind of how we wanted it. We wanted it to be kind of to where there could be a different variety of homes, and I feel that if the code has specified in each zone how many levels, I think that would address this issue.
Cynthia, were you?
I agree with that. I think being unique and have different, we don't want to be all cookie cutter, so that's what makes it so unique, as long as it doesn't create a nuisance, which goes back to what Matt said. So I think the nuisance is a...
Councilmember Ennis, I think you were.
All you have to do is go down to the corner of Cedar and Church Street. The biggest house in town is next to one of those more smaller houses, which is newer. And there's another house on Cedar and Pecan that is in the same situation. Ms. Pletch lives in the larger house, and then there's a smaller one right next door to it. It's just the town is developed that way.
Okay. Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on it? Councilmember Jackson?
Yeah, the example I was talking about earlier that we talked about was it was a situation about privacy. The larger home was next to a home that was just one story, and this house was two-story, and plus it had a porch, and it was kind of overlooking the backyard and the bedroom of the smaller house, and so the people were concerned about that at the time. I mean, they've since sold it, and now the other house is for sale again, but it was a personal privacy issue that was, you know, I think the uniqueness of having the large houses and the small houses side by side is good. It's just that when it invades privacy, that was a concern of those particular neighbors.
I don't think we're going to code out 2 stories next to 1 story.
Well,
and I kind of think when you like, I don't have to have curtains because I don't have a neighbor, but I think that's kind of why you have curtains, right?
Well, the whole
If you're gonna
backyard.
live in town and have another
Yeah.
resident 10 feet away, I think you would expect to have to be respectful of each other. I don't know. Are you suggesting that we regulate 2 stories next to a 1 story?
No, I just said that the character was very unique. I was citing an example of something that happened in the past, and I was saying that because of the backyard, and there was a swimming pool there, they were concerned about that issue. Not that we need to, be concerned about it, but it was something that happened during the time, and I just thought I'd bring it up.
So are you wanting us to regulate that, or you don't want us to regulate that?
No, I was just bringing up a particular, as I said, example of something that had happened in the past.
Okay. Patrick, did you?
And so I'll say 2 things. The first thing is I think that Paulo's in the right place, but I think that you're right that most neighbors are going to be neighborly and think about each other, and I don't think there's a way to codify out the ugly neighbor who's always going to exist somewhere and may take the advantage of privacy or something like that. So for the greater good of what we're trying to do, I agree that having different size back and forth I think will be fine. And I think the market, as we start to spread out and the land we have is developed, I think the market will set whether or not people want to live in a 1-story next to a 3-story and so on and so forth. This idea really only affects, I think, open land that's undeveloped in the current area that we're at.
Well, people can buy a lot and tear down a house and rebuild something. So I think the
I
potential is that it could exist anywhere. Pablo, the comments that Matt made regarding the envelope and the moving envelope, does that help at all?
Well, I think he's indicated that the International Building Code or International Residential Code, depending on where you're building that, would kind of make that determination. My understanding of those codes is that that's a fire-related issue, so I could potentially be right on my building line or right on my property line 5 feet away from another structure. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct. It's the health safety aspects of fire separation is.
Could you be 1 foot away?
On the rear lot line with a
on the side lot
on your same property, but not adjacent. You would have to have a 5-foot separation from your eave to eave or overhang to overhang. But in this particular scenario, the hope is that because the lot dimensions are not prescriptive, that as the blocks build out, or if it's an infill lot, that they would take into account the location of trees, the natural site. Furthermore, it would require a site walk, and that conversation should be held at the time that they submit that as well. But you bring up a valid point. I do think that this should be something to be mindful of as you progress, but I'm hopeful that because of the lot flexibility and the movable building envelope, that it would address the compatibility concerns.
Councilmember Rogers, were you going to?
Well, I think we should be able to have different size houses next to each other like they are here, because sometimes you'll have seniors that want to live, don't have any kids. They might be a big house that has, but if you put all big houses, then that's going to be Cat Mountain, and then it's just one all salary, or however you want to say it. So just having variety gives us the good neighbors we have, compared to just making a cookie cutter. You have to be this certain type of person to live in this neighborhood because you have to have a house this big.
Yeah, Matt, you had me convinced till you said hopeful a couple times, because, the code, and I think that's what Pablo's saying, is we got to make sure that to a certain extent, we are trying to get rid of regulation, but we need to control enough of our destiny. I don't know. It's a slippery slope, isn't it?
And I would say, ma'am, for every definitive problem you solve, you create two more.
Yeah.
And so I think the premise is the nuisance. That doesn't really matter how close you are to something, because it's typically a choice, as long as you don't negatively impact my ability to enjoy my property. And I think your point to the analogy that Councilmember Jackson made is, I sometimes have to do things on my property to protect my privacy, i.e. drapes, those kinds of things. But this concept, I think, is complicated further by, are we talking about greenfield or infill? Mm-hmm. Because if it's infill, we all go in knowing what's there. And so I think there, to Councilmember Ennis's point, there are multiple places in downtown that you have large-scale developments next to small-scale developments. And I think if Kevin Shepard were here, who is our consultant for the fiscal sustainability model, I think he would tell you that is what fiscal sustainability is. And so I think if our goal, we go back to our purpose statement, which is fiscal sustainability through land use, then I think, to Matt's point, you do the best you can, knowing that you can't write codes for every specific situation, but you follow them up with a nuisance, because it should never be a situation unless there's a nuisance, and if there is, we've provided for that. So my final comment is that we can't regulate preference. And a lot of the conversation we're having depends on your preference and whether it's your house and whether you want to move in. And that's a very slippery slope for us to get about preference. If there is a nuisance, then the city has a role, and we have an instrument for that. Mm-hmm. But there's always choice, and that's the beauty of fiscal sustainability downtown. If you want a small house, you can live downtown. You want a big house, you can live downtown. You want a medium-sized house, guess what? You can still live downtown. You can still walk to Tracy's. And I think that's the intent of what we're trying to do. But I don't know that there's going to be a perfect code where we can write everything. So I want to protect his hopeful, because we are being hopeful, but we can regulate the nuisance. We can't regulate preference.
Well, and I appreciate Councilmember Rogers' position of, we're not trying to create a character district that this character district is all big houses and this character district is all in the other same size of house. Yes.
One thing that I think it was a part of this discussion that we had, and I want to put out my concern again for the council, is that with these place types, so for P3, for example, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I wanted to start a daycare, for example, in my home, I wanted to watch 8 kids or whatever, then the only way to do that would be to get a place type change, correct? So my concern is that we're using the CUP that we used to use to kind of regulate certain things and allow things in certain areas where maybe it generally isn't. And I feel like we're getting away from the CUP portion, where we're doing basically a zoning change. And so, and it came up a couple times during this conversation. So my fear is, and I use Hunter's Crossing as an example, that if I have a home in Hunter's Crossing and I want to start a daycare, and the only way to do that is to convince my neighbors to be on board with me changing from a P3 to a P4, that property will forever be a P4, and I can use it for any P4 use in the future, as can any buyer. And so, while one day it may be a daycare, somebody buys it and perhaps they turn it into, a shop where people are pulling up in front. There's a lot of foot traffic back and forth. And so now our residential neighborhood has, is full of homes that are, being used for businesses and stuff like that. And it can be any business, not just, not just the one it was originally changed for. So I've advocated in our meetings for either relying more on the CUP process like we've done in the past, or putting some type of stipulation that if that change in zoning to, for example, from P3 to P4 occurs, that if it's outside the original intent of the change, that it reverts back to a P3.
One of the ways that we can address Commissioner Connell's concern is through a definition. There are cities that will regulate home-based daycare up to a certain number of kids, and that keeps it from being a commercial enterprise where traffic would be a huge problem, versus something that would be reasonable for somebody to be able to work at home, stay at home, take care of their kids and others. So we could easily address his concern through a definition.
To be clear, it's not the daycare is just an example of a change. Maybe
Yes.
I want to have a CPA business out of my home, and the only way to legally do that is to get my neighbors on board. And while my neighbors may say, "Hey,"
But no, so we need to, that's not the only way, because as long as
don't have a nuisance.
you can't see it, smell it, and you don't have
So-
20
so-
people parking
so
in the, you can
my
run a
argument for
CPA
that was
office.
that you can not see, smell, hear, or see something, but still not necessarily want it in a neighborhood, area. So, and we can't regulate the traffic in front because they're public streets. So we can't regulate, traffic and whatnot as far as people parking there and whatnot. But, my only concern is that the only way to do something inside of, would be a zoning change, and that zoning change is permanent, never reverts back to original. So while I may convince my neighbors now to be on board with me, come to city council and say, "Hey, this is a good idea. Yeah, we all want this." If 10 years later we all sell off our properties, if this one right here is a P4, I can do anything that's allowed in a P4 in that neighborhood.
And just to provide clarity, Commissioner, P4 is house form structures only, and furthermore, for home occupations, you can't have more than 4 people, four employees reporting to work. Maybe that's too high or too low. We could start modifying that number. But there are inappropriate locations for certain types of businesses in residential areas. That clarity to protect the residential character in some areas is intentional within this, to provide the ability for services to be provided on the appropriate street types, on the appropriate lots. And so maybe you start analyzing where this would be appropriate on corners or intersections first, rather than going interior lots. And so there is clarity and reason behind why you may not opt to rezone a lot in that particular scenario to that. So as Ms. Humble stated, maybe we can address your concerns through the definition of home-based businesses and really provide some clarity there in order to ensure that businesses that are reaching broader than home-based businesses actually go in the appropriate location.
What might be a use that's not a home-based business but would be allowed in like a P4 place type?
If in a P4 place type, you could put in a coffee shop. That's pretty intense.
We also
with the appropriate characteristics of the site development in the appropriate location. And again, if it's not already pre-zoned for P4, which if it's not P4 now, it wouldn't be P4 under this scenario. That would be.
But my biggest concern is, again, is the only way to do a different use is not a conditional use permit that has a stipulation to it. It's just to do a zoning change, and once it's changed forever.
And I think that's why if they're, instead of like home-based daycare, if we do home-based business and do a definition, then you shouldn't require a zoning change. And if you do give a zoning change, it would be not an easy one, and it might be because it's at a major intersection, or there would be a lot you'd have to really, to your point, clarify for everyone voting on it and around that it stays forever.
If I could convince my neighbors that we're all rah for this change and come before council and council is like, well, nobody cares, then when we kind of see the idea behind it, again, great now, 5-10 years down the road after property changes throughout that neighborhood area, we end up with a lot of spot zoning in that case if they become prevalent.
Matt, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Was it not unanimous when we spoke on this that we went with nuisance unanimously?
Yeah, it was. Now, we did have a lot of conversation about it back and forth, but at the end of the day, we unanimously said if you can't see it, hear it, smell it, do we need to regulate it?
And I will say, it was unanimous. I voted for that, but my concern was still this issue. And since
Okay, well, so I think we'll have a home-based business definition.
I think there are two things we can do to address Commissioner Connell's concern that are very legitimate. One is the definition of the home-based business, and then to allow some of these on a corner and require a CUP mid-lot, because a corner provides accessibility multiple places that doesn't impact the neighborhood quite the way something mid-lot might. So we will take your issue and vet our CUP and see if there's some things mid-lot we feel strongly about that we don't feel strongly about at a corner, and see if we can't address your concern.
Council, are you comfortable with any comments? Councilman Brenes, were you going to say something?
I think the commissioners brought up a really valid point, and I'd like to see how we come up with the definition before we finally, say, oh yeah, we're home free on this. Because once we've done it, like he says, we've done it.
You okay with that?
Yeah.
Commission?
Question for Alan is: once a zoning change occurs, there's no way for the city to unilaterally change that in the future, right? Is that? I don't think so. I'm just asking since you're here.
The city has the power to rezone whenever the council as a legislative body finds there's a need to. There's a certain checklist we follow. The city council does have the authority to unilaterally rezone property without the property owner's request or consent. It's a unilateral legislative act.
And how difficult would that be? Because if that's the case, then that fixes my whole concern here, is that, we have a change and then somebody uses it for something else. If the neighbors come back and petition the council and council says, oh, well, you know what, no big deal, we'll just push it back to a P3. That's not something I was under the impression that we could do or the city could do. So,
well, the city can, it sounds like, and I'd like to give them some time to come up with definitions and look at the codes and the regulations, and we'll have more discussion on this issue. Cool.
Excellent. So this brings us to our next one, which was the community nuisances or values. This is where we actually had the conversation about the daycares, whether it be screaming children or others. Is that something that we need to take a look at? And again, it fell on we don't think so. The direction that the P&Z and Council is going with nuisances and others seem to be appropriate. Now we will go back and kind of look at that, come up with some definitions that provide some clarity on what you can and cannot do as a home-based occupation. Curfew, we discussed, and we decided our current regulations are okay and don't need to be updated or amended. And just to clarify, currently what that means is anyone 17 years or under cannot be outside, I guess, unattended from 11 p.m. Until 30 minutes before sunrise, Sunday through Thursday, and then on Friday and Saturday, that's midnight until 30 minutes before sunrise. We talked about different construction hours, and currently how we have it is not a good way to have it because it doesn't provide any flexibility, and sometimes during the summer you want to work and take advantage of that extra daylight. And so the nuisance ordinance is going to be updated to say, and this was already in the works, but it'll be construction hours from 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset. And so you'll kind of be able to take advantage of that extra daylight during the summertime, and then dial it back during the winter when it's dark at 5 p.m.
So is there an ability to get an exception? Because sometimes, like if there's a major concrete pour, you need to do it at night when the trucks can get there, and you can do one truck behind another,
There's not currently. I've seen that in other codes where it can be approved by council. So if you have a big, you can have it approved by somebody. You can certainly write that in there.
It would be my preference that we bring it to council because it is a communication opportunity to explain the whys and the wherefores. So we would do that on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
Would we also look at this in relation to the place type? The different place types is going to define what we can do with construction relative to noise, nuisance, and other.
It would be my recommendation that you don't, because we're only 4 miles square, and there isn't much on one side of town that the other side of town can't hear, and that noise travels, particularly with the OSHA regulations of your heavy equipment that has the backup alarm that hours everybody can hear it. So it would be my suggestion that anything outside of this is on a case-by-case basis. We bring it back to council, and that would just be one of the factors you consider when you vote yes or no.
Yeah, I'm thinking there would be very, very few exceptions. I just wanted to know there would be a methodology for an exception, because it could be, I can think of instances where it's to our advantage, ultimately to everyone else's advantage, that they can do one continuous pour, it's one bad night and you're done, instead of it's costing more, the product is work, you know.
It also gives you the flexibility in, you know, a disaster and or emergency or other situations. You write that into the code. So.
Okay. We also have street work that lots of times they do it in the evenings because it's just easier.
Right.
And the only exceptions I see is the Katy Railroad at 5 o'clock in the morning.
It's your own special alarm clock, isn't it?
All right, so we'll work at writing in an exception on that one. Loitering we talked about. We don't have any current regulations on loitering. There is some criminal trespass, which is state law, and it seems to have worked okay, and so P&Z didn't recommend making any changes to that. We actually also talked about camping in public, and said our current regulations where that is prohibited it seems to be okay and working, and so no changes or recommendations to amend anything like that was made on camping either. And those were the things that we talked about for nuisances. Any questions, comments?
Councilman Jackson?
Just one thing, I mean, I don't want to belabor this because it seems like everything is worked out. With the curfews, the current regulations, I know there are child labor laws and things like that, and are there exceptions to that for children? I mean, that may be working on weekends and things like that, or I know there's a certain number of hours that can work per week and all of that, but if they are employed, I mean, they're able to get a waiver of some type for that, I'm sure, right?
So we talked about that at P&Z, and the chief was able to answer that question. So his officers can use a level of discretion on that. So if you're clearly coming to or from work and or a sanctioned school event, they will use their better judgment on that. Clearly, if you're out and you shouldn't be, they're trained and well equipped to handle those situations. So they didn't have any problems with it. The police department at this time, and didn't recommend any changes.
And we don't have people coming to council and complaining about it, so it seems to be.
For that one point, Chief, if they did get a ticket, they could always take it and tell the judge where they were, and so they could always defend it. So.
Okay. All right, so those were the nuisances or community values we discussed. The next one was accessory dwelling units. Again, this was another great topic of conversation. We covered a lot of ground, but where we ended up were a few recommendations that I think are excellent recommendations. They recommended to allow up to 2 ADUs per site total if it can fit within the impervious cover percentage for that place type. So as long as your main structure and the 2 ADUs fall under the impervious cover limit for that place type, that they thought that would be okay. Now there might be certain circumstances where you're already pushing that impervious cover in a place type, and that would limit the number of ADUs you could have on that lot, but they didn't see a need to limit it to 1 or 2 anywhere. And then anything, but they again wanted that kind of flexibility within the code. So when they were talking about it, they talked about anything over 2 ADUs would require a CUP, a conditional use permit. That's also a wise thing to do because as we discussed at P&Z, anytime you have over 2 ADUs on one property, it kicks in certain fire requirements like fire access lanes and things like that. So that's something that you all as the P&Z and council would want to take a look at with that conditional use permit. And then they also talked about not allowing them in the front yard. And the verbiage in the new code would, I think, be the first layer. So you have different setbacks and or layers where things are not permitted, and so you would not have an ADU, Matt, correct me, in the front yard would also be the front layer on any lot. And the topic of conversation there was not to have an accessory dwelling unit in front of the primary structure. So in order to kind of prohibit that, they came up with the no ADUs in the front yard of the first layer. Then we also talked about language for ADUs to be allowed by certain building types. And so that would be kind of regulated again by the the place type and the building types that are allowed under that place type in each character zone. And then again, tying the ADUs back to the fire code, so anything above 2 ADUs would trigger that fire access. And I wanted to point something out quickly. There was an article that I came across that was giving praises to the city of Seattle for having the most progressive ADU ordinance just approved. And what they approved is exactly what P&Z has recommended to council for approval. So
Okay,
here,
which one of
here in
y'all went to
Bastrop, we're just
Portland?
on the edge. So we're keeping up with the big guys in that circumstance. But they were good conversations. We did talk a lot about impervious cover. We spent a lot of time talking about building setbacks and others. But again, we always fell back, or the P&Z Commission always pointed back to that life safety through the I-codes, being able to regulate that, and then also the fiscal sustainability, the ability to have the flexibility to have introduce different product types to the market and things of that, and open up kind of that ceiling to get into the Bastrop housing market is where they ultimately landed. So those are, I believe, all the things that they talked about with ADUs.
I think you guys did a great job on this summary, and I'll get input from council, but just for the community or anybody that may be watching from home, an accessory dwelling unit, think of, people call them granny flats. It may have been a carriage house, but it can be, people call them small apartments. It's a unit that someone can dwell in that is not the primary residence on a lot. So in my mind, that opens different housing price points. It's a way to get affordable housing and folks to be able to live. It may allow somebody's mother-in-law to live next to their grandkids, but still have some privacy. So there's multiple uses. Pablo?
I think ADUs are a great answer for middle housing. They can be there now. You can buy them. They're prefab and they can be hauled in. So they can certainly meet any kind of building form we're trying to. So there's also some people have even thought about RVs. And that's something that we had talked about by looking at the building type. But the question I don't know if I didn't bring it up last time, is short-term rentals. I think that we're close enough to a lot of attractions around here so something to think about is how that impacts these.
I think that's a whole different topic, don't you, Alan? Short-term rental? Yeah. And knowing that we're coming to the budget, what I'm most interested in short-term rentals is, number one, they're not a nuisance to their neighbors, and number two, they're paying their hot tax. So with that, council, do you have comments on the accessory dwelling units? Anybody? Councilmember Ennis? Nope.
I have one.
I'm sorry, Cheryl.
That's okay. So I've spent a better part of the last few days rewatching council meetings just to kind of refresh my brain on what was said during some of the council workshops. So I can't remember if this was said during the workshop or I might have read the same article you read from Seattle, but I saw something about the primary structure or the additional dwelling units not being bigger than the primary structure. And I can't remember if that was talked about through us or I read it somewhere, but I don't remember discussing it.
We talked about that. If the accessory dwelling unit was larger than the primary structure, what defines it as the accessory dwelling unit at that point? So we did have a brief conversation about that. I think the bigger concern was not having a smaller one in front of the primary structure, but we can certainly talk about that, whether it's you don't want it larger or smaller, but at the end of the day, if one's larger or smaller, whether it's primary or not, its function as a dwelling unit that is allowed in that place type. So I'm not sure that defining it would do anything from a regulatory standpoint from the zoning code.
I think the biggest concern that we had was, and for not having more than two and not having the front yard, is having like a main structure with like little huts in front or something like that. So if it's larger than the main structure and it's in the front, on a very deep lot, then it just becomes the primary structure. Or we define it as the largest structure on the property is the primary structure, and. So if you build an ADU that's bigger, then as soon as you complete it and you get a CO, it becomes a primary structure for any future, consideration. So that's the conversation I remember having, not necessarily defining, a certain size, but the biggest one, that's the primary.
And is it agreed that when you say larger, that it's livable square footage? Because it could be the second story of a garage
livable, I think,
in front of a one-story house, and now is that now bigger, or is it?
I think it was livable square footage, I think, is what we talked about.
Yeah. Okay. So we need, I'm just saying, we need to make sure that we're clear about that definition. Larger is.
But they're still going to regulate the
impervious cover.
Right. So I mean, not going to, unless your house is really small, you can't put a really big, extra unit because you won't have that much coverage.
Yeah, I was just saying, if you have a one-story house
I was
and
just
you have a
making
garage
sure
in the
that
back,
they
if you
weren't
put
gonna-
one on top, you could say, well, now you've made the garage and the accessory
Oh, I
unit
understand.
bigger.
What you were saying, yeah.
I think it was when we talked about living space was the only consideration. So
Yeah, but you're right, Councilmember Rogers, the impervious cover for the lot will take care of that.
if you have a really deep lot though and a smaller house in the back, you could afford to build a much larger house. Some of the stuff.
Then it could become your primary, is to your point.
Right, and that's just how the city would define it.
You have an example of that behind your daughter's house. The garage apartment, two-story, is much larger than the house, the primary residence, and it's pretty easy to tell which is the primary and which is the accessory.
Yeah, and that particular lot is a corner lot, so there's not, it's like
Right.
nobody's raising cane.
Yeah, and the point is, I think what this does is allow people also to age in place. So you might have the property owner living in a smaller unit, and again, it's regulatory. Call it primary or an ADU. They're all dwelling units.
Yep.
And it would be difficult to come up with a definition that would, work everywhere, I think. But I think the way that the buildings, Matt has built the code, that they have to interact with the street and the different setbacks and the flexibility in the lots, not having the rigidness of the lot size and everything, really lends itself well to this type of dwelling unit. So,
Council, we're all okay?
okay, tree preservation. So we this gets a stir. This was before my time, so I don't get the inside joke, but I do appreciate it, I think. So a lot of work was done by P&Z on the tree preservation ordinance about a year ago, actually. And so they had actually a lot of good historical knowledge on this topic. So what we did was start with where they left off last year as a base, and then looked at ways that they wanted to modify that. So when looking through that, these are a few recommendations that came off that. So currently there's not a definition for a heritage tree, and the thought behind a heritage tree is that no matter where it exists in town, that tree is valuable to the environment, it's valuable to the community, and so that should be something that the city would want to protect anywhere within the city limits. So we looked at a few other municipalities, we looked at some other things, and just a lot of different, a lot of others throughout the state, how they define that, and 24 inches is about the average where people start putting that minimum, that anything 24 inches above is a heritage tree. It's valuable to the whole community, and so P&Z is recommending that anything 24 inches and above be classified as a heritage tree. So we'll add definitions for that. And the heritage tree would actually be protected anywhere and from anyone. So whether you're a homestead property owner, whether the city is doing something or the state is doing something, the P&Z would make recommendations that tree would be protected in the new tree preservation ordinance.
Excuse me, Matt. What if that tree becomes a nuisance to the property owner?
If it is okay. If it's dead or dying, then there's exceptions written into the tree preservation ordinance. So if it's like decaying, or if a storm blew through, and knocked it down, and it is now a danger, then there are exemptions in that ordinance written in for circumstances like that.
Is nuisance in your mind, you're tired of raking the leaves and you're ready for it to go?
No.
Matt, is the with the heritage trees, though, it's not the same as it's. You have to have like a. Did we discuss having like a botanist or somebody come out, or the city come out certifying that it is, if it's a heritage tree, that it is a nuisance. So like if the storm comes in and knocks down, half the tree, but the tree is still okay, that the property owner doesn't just lop it off and come back and go, oh well, the storm came in. If it's a heritage tree only, then some third party has to come out.
That's right. Never regulate that.
But the reference that I'm talking about is, I'm sure most of us know by now, there's a property owner that has a sign for business, has a tree that's intruding with their sign. So either the tree or the sign has to go.
I think in that case it would be the sign.
The tree or the sign has to go?
Excuse me. But the tree is impeding on the sign and pushing the sign over.
Well, I think a certain level of pruning could be done to a tree in most circumstances, similar to like power lines and things of that nature, that would let a certified arborist and or a landscape professional come out there and prune that tree that would protect that from happening. But I don't know. That's not something that we discussed at P&Z, whether one goes or the other. But the P&Z is recommending that they become like the tree variance approvers or the tree board. I know we had a tree board prior to. The park board is the tree board, but the P&Z would like to be the ones who hear those variances to the trees. But I would like to state that we looked at the tree planting list, and so things like hackberries, mesquites, and things like that are not included in any of the protected trees. And so just because if you have a 24-inch mesquite tree, for example, you can cut that down all day long. It's just certain classifications, so like the loblollies, post oaks, cypresses, things like that are considered a value and a benefit to the community. Those would be the protected trees. And so anything that's not on the protected tree list, you could cut down on any piece of property in the city.
Is there a process to decertify a tree from a heritage tree?
So that would be the exception, and that would be coming to the Planning and Zoning Commission.
I just wanted to ask the commission if we still wanted to be the arbiter of variances on trees.
I think the idea behind it was that if they came to us, the job of the planning and zoning is to make recommendations to the council, whether you ask us to look into something or we just notice something that and a recommendation needs to be made. That's part of the purpose. So if these things are coming before us frequently and we look at it as like there might be a policy change and we're seeing those, we can make that recommendation. If we don't ever see them, though, we'll never.
But the current policy isn't the Parks Board, the Tree Advisory Board. So current policy it's not in your bailiwick, it's with Parks.
I realize that. That's why we're requesting it to
and they make recommendations to council just
as
like
well.
P&Z. The only and I don't vote, I'm just making an observation. We have built codes around personal property rights, and I think in this moment we need to acknowledge that fiscal sustainability and heritage trees have value to the community that may be bigger than personal property rights. I think that we're absolutely taking the right action, because when you think about the Lost Pines Character District, if we had somebody come in and clear cut all of the loblolly pines that make us special, then we're not special anymore. So this falls under the environmentally, geographically sensitive aspect of your purpose statement. But I do want to call your attention to that this is where there is conflict to the personal property rights of people, but it's being done under the context of geographically sensitive and the fiscal sustainability that trees add to value to property.
But this is a completely different ordinance.
So we had lengthy discussions about individual property rights,
So,
and we came down on the side of the heritage trees.
I'll say that when we had this discussion, I'm private property rights all the way, and although I'm in striking distance of Pablo, when he recommended the heritage tree, my initial thing was, well, when we had this discussion previously, we all sided on property rights. After further discussion, I have slightly been swayed to support the heritage tree, but only if it is absolute, meaning in the original draft, the city over with improvements could get rid of a heritage tree or something of that nature, and that should not be the case. If we're going to tell the citizens that a heritage tree is intended to be protected, as long as we can regulate it and we have a say-so, nobody, the city, the state, county, anybody within our jurisdiction should not be allowed. So if we're putting a road, that road goes around that tree, we don't knock down the tree and go through it. Because I just don't think it's right to tell the citizens on your private property you can't cut down a heritage tree.
I don't think you're going to be very successful telling the state what they can do.
If we have the jurisdiction and we have a say-so in our area, that's all I'm saying, is that the heritage trees are protected absolutely without exceptions. So being the city government doesn't mean we can, cut one down to put a road in, or a developer comes in and throws a bunch of cash at it and gets to cut it down. They're either important and should be protected, or they're not.
Councilmember Jackson?
I didn't get a chance to do my homework on this, but I just remembered something that happened to me when I moved to Tahitian, because they have a architectural committee that determines what trees you can cut and which trees you can't. And since they're in the city limits, I was wondering if we've worked with that committee, with their property owners association, because they have certain rules and regulations, diameters and things, and I don't have the specific information, but I know there were some trees that I wanted to cut down that I was told I couldn't cut down unless they became a hazard or they became a nuisance to my property and safety. But there was a certain diameter I could cut down and the others I couldn't. And I don't know if we've worked with that property owners association with their rules and regulations, because some parts of Tahitian, of course, are in the city limits. And I wanted to make sure they aren't in conflict with our ordinance.
They can be more restrictive than our ordinance. And there's a lot of planned development districts throughout the city who have different regulations that you shall have X amount of trees in your front yard and everything like that. So this would deal with primarily when you're removing trees. And so the HOAs and a lot of times have different rules that would apply for front yard trees and or caliper. But nothing in this would be under 24 inches.
Let me say what he just said a different way, council member. A lot of your subdivisions have deed restrictions that have nothing to do with the planned development or relationship. So we do not regulate civil matters, and deed restrictions are deemed civil. So if they have an architectural committee and they have the means to enforce that, as Matt said, they can be more restrictive. We will not aid in their enforcement. So if they want you to cut down a tree, you choose not to cut down a tree, they come to us to help with that, we're going to tell them that is a civil matter and we don't get in it.
I'm a real supporter of the heritage tree concept. But as someone who has been on the forefront of historic preservation in this town ever since I moved here, we have a process where we go through and designate structures in town as historically significant. And once those are designated, you can remove them from the list. However, it's not easy. And it goes before City Council. Am I correct in that, Mr. Jones?
To have it removed from the historically?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe that would go to HLC and then to Council.
Yes. I don't see how we can designate something as a heritage tree and not give an owner the right to due process to come to maybe P&Z and then to council to decertify that tree. I think that's tantamount to a taking, to the commissioner's point. I think we ought to have some form of due process in this thing to decertify the tree. It's not going to happen much, I wouldn't think, but to Councilman Peterson's comment, what if it becomes a problem of some sort?
Can I add a point to that? When we do variance, we consider a lot of things too, and I think it's a similar process, but it's not like you can go to and get a variance to do something against land development code just because it's going to save you money. You have to show a hardship, and I think in this case, the hardship regarding the sign, the question would be, can it be moved? Without knowing the situation and looking at it, I think the whole point of the heritage tree that I was arguing for is that it's a community asset, and I think we should think about it that way. It's part of our logo. I mean, certainly the loblollies are easy to understand better, but even some of these large oak trees, they're hundreds of years old. If we're going to say you can cut them down and there's no problem, I think we're opening ourselves up to something.
So I missed the tree section of the code. Would the tree ordinance be standalone?
No, it would be embedded into the new code.
Okay, because there was. It's not currently in there, but it would become a subsection.
That's correct.
And so what you guys are talking about is including in the code only heritage trees.
No, heritage trees would only be the ones that cannot be removed. There's also a protected tree. Sorry, give me a second.
So this is something we haven't seen yet.
Right.
Wouldn't it be better for us to see it before we talk about it?
This is one of the topics you wanted them to vet and offer recommendations and then bring to you for further discussion. This would be the handoff for y'all to then debate it.
So it sounds like, having heard this discussion, we would like an opportunity to look at the ordinance.
You absolutely will. Like the city manager's point, this is the handoff, and you will again have a conversation to discuss this amongst yourself as a council.
Okay, does that make sense to you, council? A chance to review it? Councilmember Peterson?
Yes, I totally agree. We need to look at that closely because if we say heritage tree, what is a heritage tree? We have to define that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And let me throw something else at you. If we got a so-called heritage tree and under the ordinance, the city, you can't cut it, and we have a windstorm and you get property damage, who's liable?
You could remove it then. I mean, it's already been half removed. There are ways around that. If it becomes damaged, if it becomes disease, if it's raising up your foundation, those are exceptions that could enable you to remove a heritage tree.
I think that's what we're having trouble with is we're defining it, but we don't have the background on it to define what happens, in the situations you're talking about.
Well, what we wanted to bring to you today was what you asked us to vet, and we're giving you the benefit of our thoughts and where our heads were and what we deem important in this issue.
Well, one thing we never got clarification on, maybe we can because Alan's here, maybe you guys have done since the last meeting, is can you enforce this through civil fines or something versus just a city ordinance? Because one of the concerns we had is that if the only way to enforce this is a city ordinance and the maximum fine is $500, then if I have to go through a $1,500 process to remove it or to change it, I'll just cut it down, write me a ticket, I'll pay the $500 fine and move on. So are we able to enforce it via civil?
So rather than debate the merits of this, the point of this was for them to hand it off. Y'all gave them a list, and this is probably about 5% of 100% conversation. And once we hand this off, Matt will bring this back to you in a work session, and it will be a thoughtful, deliberative conversation because when you get the rest of the details, a lot of this will make sense.
Yeah, and I think you guys have covered really great stuff. There needs to be a definitive point. I see you trying to balance property rights with community assets, but have some logical common sense to back it up. So I feel like we just now need the rest of the story and finish the conversation. And as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to planning and zoning, but in my mind, council has not certainly has not voted and has not discussed. We have many boards that make recommendations to us, and so we do have a current policy that it's park board, and they might want an opportunity to have a comment on that as well. So I just don't want, if someone's on the park board is at home, I don't want them to think, well, they didn't even ask us, and no decision has been made. Planning and zoning is saying there may be a logic to us reviewing this, and council will need to do some homework and make a decision on that. Is that a fair assessment?
And that was only
Chairman?
a small part of the discussion on the tree issue. I
Yeah.
promise you. And the overall time we spent on this, whether we regulate it or it stays with parks, was a small thing. We feel very strongly about, we'd like for you to hear the rest of have the benefit of our thoughts on the rest of these topics before you go back and look at it, which we spent a lot of time on.
And when this comes to you, you'll see the 7-page ordinance that they have already vetted, and then these were the topics off of that 7-page ordinance. So that you'll have all that backup information. Yes.
Terrific. Thank you for your work.
Yeah, no problem. And also, they talked about adding an approved planting list, and that gets back to defining what protected trees should be. So should not be mesquites, hackberries, things of that nature. So it will define what we'll actually protect and what we won't protect. And then they talked about adding a critical root zone that would be protected during construction, for example. So if you're doing construction on site, you're going to want to maintain a level of protection around those protected trees so they don't get damaged and or die during the construction process or sometime shortly after. So those are the recommendations. Again, this is just their recommendations and thoughts coming off that 7-page document that you all will take a holistic look at in the future. Any questions? All righty.
No, don't say questions. Keep moving.
Oh, keep moving. All right, there you go. Street sections. We took a look at this, and based off the sections that have been provided by Matt Lewis, not really any changes were made, just kind of thoughts and process and agreements that they should be walkable, that they should accommodate multimodal transportation opportunities, whether that's through bike lanes, shared lanes, and other, and that it might not always be appropriate to have sidewalks on both sides. So you might have instances where, although you want to be walkable, it's not always necessary to have sidewalks on both sides and or everywhere. In certain character districts like the Lost Pines and others where you want to preserve that, those might not even be necessary. So I think they were in agreement with what they saw.
One pitch I want to make is that in the multimodal issue, pull-offs for vans or other vehicles that are transporting or buses, and we can get them out of the travel lane, should be considered in future development. Maybe the council member seats down might agree.
Yeah, I think if we're going to be a multimodal community, you have to consider curb cuts in any of your street improvements to allow for not only the movement of safe movement of people on and off of whatever vehicle they're traveling on, but also the constant movement of traffic so it's not impeded, as it oftentimes is.
There was one other point, I don't know, it's not on here, but maybe that you can look at also bike lanes and how to integrate that. And I know there was discussion about making it, with the grid that we have, it's a very bikeable, we have, by sticking to the block form, we have a pretty bikeable system there, but I don't know if that's, it's clear on some of the larger thoroughfares, so I don't know. That was something we brought up.
So I'll not ask any more questions. I'll just keep moving. So signs was another pretty lively conversation. Again, the P&Z would like to be the variance review authority on variances to the signs. They made a recommendation that no pylons or pole signs would be allowed. They had a lengthy conversation about neon. And decided that neon is an appropriate building material to have signs made out of, so neon would be allowed. We went back and forth on the maximum height for signage and went up to, I think, as tall as 70 feet. We had conversations about, but landed back on 35 feet for monuments, so long as it does not violate any maximum height for that district. So if the district has a height under the 35 foot, that would effectively become the maximum sign height for that district. Linking the monument sign material and architectural style to the primary buildings, so they recommended doing that, and then keeping some of the monument standards from the current code, and then also in terms of a damaged sign, when it does become damaged, lower the threshold from 60% to a lesser percentage to be able to replace that non-conforming sign. So they wanted to reduce that percentage. So that's the recommendations that they had on the signs.
I just had a concern about monument signs, and there are a couple of signs in town that are monument signs, and maybe it's because I drive a smart car and it's low to the ground, but they're on corners, and I can't seem to see around. I have to almost pull in the middle of the street in order to see around the monument signs, and I'm wondering if in our ordinance, if there might be some way in the future, if we're going to have monument signs, that the placement doesn't, impede or impact the visibility, because there's one right on Chestnut that I have a problem with every time I'm driving and stopping at that corner. I have to pull into the street almost to see around that monument sign. And I brought it up in the past, and it just, because it's there, it's an existing sign, but I'm wondering if that's something that we might look into in the future with monument signs.
So site visibility or a visibility triangle is the appropriate way to do that. So it has to be set back a certain amount from that corner, and then you make a triangle, and anything in that visibility triangle is essentially a no-build zone. Would be the way to protect against that, and we can certainly look at writing that in.
If it's already if it's in existence now, because of the, safety hazards and things, not just me, but I'm sure there are other people with smaller cars that cannot see around that corner, around that. There are two places, and they're on Chestnut, but I guess I can just try to.
Yeah, so that would be another point on the threshold. So when the sign's either destroyed and/or you're repairing or replacing, you can have a certain threshold for non-conforming signs that once you hit this percentage, whatever that might be, that sign can no longer be rebuilt. So as those signs deteriorate, sometimes municipalities also do, when they pass an ordinance, they give a grace period, and then anything after that, those days have expired, then those signs would have to be removed. But that's going to have to be a policy discussion.
That was part of lowering this threshold. The very last bullet on this is that if we lower that threshold to 50 or below, that as signs become destroyed or somebody runs into them or whatever, they have to rebuild them and be more in compliance.
So I did, again, go back and look at some of the other workshops that you guys had, because I was one for the 50 feet in height. And so I went back and watched one of the videos, and that was a discussion that you guys had at length in one, I think it was the March video, maybe. It wasn't April. But, and Linda actually pointed out that we, again, want to make this to a point where we don't have a bunch of people coming back for variances or requests for changes. The way that this is designed is to try to allow for more flexibility. And one of the things that the city manager pointed out was if we put it at 35 and then another developer or business comes in and they want a 50 feet and they come to P&Z and they come to council and then we approve that, it could start just a storm of phone calls to council about why so-and-so was allowed 50 feet and I'm at 35. So, and that was the argument that I was trying to make at our last P&Z meeting, but conversations happened and it kind of got lost in translation. But I do want to refer back to that conversation that council had regarding allowing for a variance and not setting it too low to where we end up having to override it down the road.
One of the conversations that Matt and I just had, that this may come back to you, that was the whole point of creating the 71 corridor character district, was solely based on the height of the sign. And you're exactly right. What we do not want to do is create legal non-conforming signs, because it's nothing more than a behind whipping for staff, and it always ends up in front of you, and you always grant a variance because we're just not going to tell a business owner they can't fix their sign, and it's just no good deed goes unpunished. So I'm not sure that y'all discussed that with the 71 corridor being the exception, but that was the whole reason that Matt and his team created that as a separate corridor was solely based on the height of the sign, and we would allow signage at a height for 71 that we would not allow anywhere else.
Based on the speed limit of...
That's right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we talk about some of the larger signs off 71 were 35 feet? I think that's how we came down to the 35 feet. Is that if most of the signage along 35 or 71 is already 35 feet, to go much higher than that may not be needed. And I think it might have been staff or somebody brought it up that most people are use their phones and their GPS to get places. They don't need to be able to see to get off 2 miles back because they're mapping themselves somewhere. So having any sign over 35 feet may not be needed.
Well, Commissioner Connell, as you may not have fielded as many phone calls from people who own businesses along 71. I think that signage is still considered a major
I'm not
part
saying
of
it's
their
important,
marketing.
but
And I
the
know
idea
you
of
wouldn't
a-
be holding your phone in your hand when you were looking for. I'm joking because of the ordinance. It's just that was was
Right.
on the paper. But I understand what you're saying. Things are changing. People are jumping in the back of a Uber and somebody's dropping you off. But I think we need to. I think you guys are making a fantastic recommendation, and I don't vote. That's my personal opinion. I like the idea of the height being specific to the character district, but I think Linda's point was 71 by definition is already different than anywhere else in town. It's got the faster speed limit, already has the higher signs, and we don't need to create nonconformance and unfair competition, and so I think we're trying to balance that. Is that where we are? Council, do you have comments on signs or sign heights? I'm sorry, Councilmember Rogers.
Okay, I have a couple comments, and I come to P&Z, or told you guys I was going to have a bunch of comments on this. A couple things to think about. Okay, once you cross the Colorado River, and you're on the Loop 150 right there, and it is in your character district to have a monument sign, but I don't think what you guys don't realize is the highway department planted all those trees there. So if you put a monument sign there, it is no good because the highway department planted trees and you can't do anything about it. That's the highway department. So to punish the businesses that are there that are already set far back from the highway, to have a monument sign where the highway department planted the trees on their own land, it might be a little bit something to think about. The other thing to think about is you're thinking of 95 and you're trying to make that a lot commercial. Maybe you should allow them to have maybe not a 71 pole sign, but a little bit smaller pole sign because those on 95, they're going 95 miles an hour as it is. So that might just be another district that you think about not having to have a monument sign. So sometimes you just have to, I know that we always think, well, I want it to be beautiful, but you also have to think that these people are trying to survive too. So just try to make it as much easier. And the thing about the variance, it is very frustrating for, Doc to go get a variance, and I come to town, didn't know I could ask for a variance, and how come he has it and I don't have it? So just don't make rules that you're going to keep changing for the person across the street, because it's not fair to the people that didn't realize how to play by the rules, or trying to play by the rules, didn't know they could ask for forgiveness. So just think about it, because I think these are kind of very limiting. So that was my comment.
Thank you, Councilmember Rogers. Council, any other comments on signs? You guys, Cynthia, we're okay? All right.
Sorry, next we talked about applications and checklists. So again, these are just kind of general guidances to Matt Lewis and our staff as we put these together. So create flowcharts for each process type, so zoning, site plan, plating, etc. Have them be interactive as possible. They talked about including hyperlinks and or different embedding things, so you can click on it and it's specific to that certain process. So just having it more interactive on the website. Simplifying the paperwork process. So instead of having a checklist and then an application, have the checklist as a part of the application, so you don't have to print two separate documents, but it's all bundled together. Again, hyperlinking the code with the checklist references and also to different areas of the code itself. So if there's a requirement on a checklist, that would be hyperlinked, and then it would direct you to that area of the code. Provide pictures to help educate people on the process as part of the website presentation. allow for electronic submission. This is, of course, a goal that we have that we're moving towards. Remove redundant information was one of the things, and then seeing if we can do forms that autofill as a part of that, not a fillable PDF, but a true working document that you can fill out applications online and submit those to staff. And then again, combining the checklist online and having them interactive. So again, just kind of general direction on providing better process applications and checklists and flowcharts.
I think that sounds great, Council. Sounds like that makes it easier. I like that. Yeah, and you can't submit till you put something into every blank, and things that we can do to help staff, things that we can do to help people that are applying for the permit, so that know. I would even think of some of the processes. Maybe, do I need a permit? This is what I'm doing, so that there's some help for folks as we roll out the new stuff.
And we will be marrying this into the state mandated service that's been dictated by the recent House bill that says we have to get things through in 30 days or less, or they're deemed approved. So we are in the middle of doing a wholesale review of all of our processes. So a lot of this will happen in order to meet the state mandated requirements.
I think I appreciate y'all's list, and it seems very thorough, and I even see developers back behind you nodding yes, their heads yes, so that's a good thing.
That's a good point, Mayor. We have two different audiences that we're attempting to provide some insight and guidance to. One is our citizens who are in place that want to make some changes on our property, and the other is our developers who are coming in. And the easier that we can make it on both those audiences, as well as complying with the state mandates, the better off we are as a city. Thank you all.
This one's kind of interrelated. It's the flow chart. So again, just some direction on providing more pictures, create a more interactive development process online. So you might have a flow chart, and once you get to a site plan, you'll be able to click on how to get a site plan approved, and it'll say DRC, you have to go through P&Z, et cetera, et cetera. So just again, making that more interactive and user-friendly to serve both of our customers, the citizens and the development community. And again, point to the different processes and forms through the application. So those two are kind of intertwined.
Good job.
Yep. And last but not least, our favorite topic, parking regulations. So we went through, and generally speaking, most of the recommendations on restricting parking on impervious cover, and or having maximums rather than minimums, because they saw the presentation that you all received on how bad regulations can lead to unintended consequences. So generally speaking, they were okay with the recommendations and the place types. So like in P1, for example, in nature, it would be restricted on an impervious cover limit. When you get into the P3s, you would have different maybe shared options. P4, and then it gets more intensive into the P5. One thing we talked about introducing in the P5 was paid parking. And we did have some energetic conversations on that. But ultimately, P&Z was not ready to make a recommendation on that. They said they needed more data and cost analysis prior to taking a look at whether or not to know that it would be something that the city should do on a cost analysis. One other thing that came up was increased parking directional signage downtown, just letting people know that there is additional parking downtown other than the street parking. So generally speaking, again, they were okay with kind of the glimpse that you all saw when we had our conversations, and again, we'll cover this again with the exception of paid parking. They were not ready to move on that.
Yeah, dare I stick my toe into the paid parking conversation? Just clarify that that's something that could be by district.
It would be more than that. It would be by place type. So you wouldn't even have like paid parking where residential exists in your downtown district. It would be like in the place type. So the place type 5, your core, and it's not saying that every parking space in that district would be paid. It's saying, hey, maybe there's some areas where if we pay for parking here, the parking lots are free, for example. But yes, it's very specific and not broad.
It will be I will tell you guys, I leaned over to Chairwoman Moore and said, we're going to end up with having a paid parking night just like we did with the chickens, I know, before it's all over. But there's many ways to skin the cat, and so if folks are watching at home, we're not saying absolutely we're not having paid parking, and we're not saying absolutely every parking place is going to be paid. It's going to be a discussion. Council will ultimately vote on it, and to P&Z's point and recommendation, there's going to be some more data. There are significant studies that show there are some advantages to doing that, but again, not blanket and not something that we're deciding on or voting on tonight.
Yes, ma'am, because it would be staff's recommendation that wherever there is paid parking, that you would create a parking district so that it becomes a utility, and that is a dedicated funding source that is identified up front, and you establish what it's going to go to.
Yes.
So that nobody is confused about the rules of engagement should you choose
And
to pay
that's
for
where I was
parking.
going. That we would be restrictive about where the paid parking, if we did it, I would believe that staff would bring us a recommendation that would have paid parking in specific areas, and that the funds that are generated by that paid parking would not just jump over into the general fund. It would be very specific to maintain and keep the area around that parking taken care of. So she also said, yeah, we're not taking that whole deal on by ourselves. So I appreciate that. So Matt, is that your last slide?
No, one more,
Okay.
just the next step. So anything that we need to, we have 2 regular meetings left before the September meeting where they'll have the public hearing. So if needed, they can talk about things, items during that. And then right now, currently, we have it scheduled to go the B3 codes for public hearing, and then they would take action on these recommendations on September 26th.
Mayor, there are a few things that we want to talk about tonight that will be happening. First of all, there's a technical manual that will accompany the development codes, and Matt Lewis and his team have pledged to get those to us on August 1st. We will upload those and make those available to the public on August 1st on the Building Bastrop website or webpage. Staff is going to have a very detailed conversation with Matt and his team on the 8th of August, and we are scheduling a meeting on the 15th that will not be a come and go, that will be a sit down around the table, go page by page with engineers, developers, and folks that live and die by the technical manual. So that would go before P&Z for their review and comments on the 28th of August. Matt and his team have taken the feedback that we've gotten through the public process that closed at the end of June, and are evaluating the comments, and the ones that make sense, that are in compliance with our purpose statement. They are making those changes, and we hope to have a revised building code published the first part of August. I'm not going to say definitely August 1st, but the first part of August. We too will make that available on the Building Bastrop page and send out an email letting folks know that. So on August 29th, P&Z will review the technical manual and the comments. They will review the revised building block code with the changes just as a last step, with the expectation that we will still have time between August 29th and September 26th for them to hear it for the first time, and everybody will have seen it, touched it, talked about it, seen it again, talked about it one final time, and then it will come to y'all for adoption in October.
I know we had discussed it, and I'm really happy that there's going to be another release of the draft, so it'll be like a 1.1, because I know it was great to get it. I'm thrilled that we made the commitment of the May 24th, but I know there were some typos and some funky things that could kind of distract from when you were trying to read through some of the bulk of it, and that I also think it's a really good idea to have some feedback for people who have made comments in planning and zoning to be able to see another version of it, so we don't go from the preliminary first draft to the final and kind of go along the way. Council Art, does that make sense to you? You happy with the timeline? Okay. I want to personally thank each of you that are here tonight, and those that are on planning and zoning that were not able to be here tonight. You guys have done a tremendous amount of work together as a group and individually, and Commissioner Lee, you get special kudos for ever wanting to sit back and rewatch an entire council meeting. So I really, honestly, a heartfelt thanks. I know I'm speaking on behalf of council, but you guys are doing really, really important work, and it's very, very much appreciated. So it is 6:02 with no further business. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just have something that I've been wanting to introduce, and I just didn't know when the right opportunity was, and didn't want to step over or out of bounds or out of line or out of procedure. But Councilmember Jones, upon her exit, had requested consideration to change the North End, the name of the North End to North Park, and which I think is a great idea. When she said it, I thought it was a great idea, and I've contemplated on it more since she brought it up. And I think that changing the name would be consistent with that area. Because of the baseball parks that we have. We also have the Jewel Hodges Park. We also now have Delgado Park. So I think that that would stay within the character of the north end of town by changing it to North Park. I've also made mention to several of the commissioners and some members of council of some ideas that I would like to, at some point, introduce to council regarding how, in going with that name change, we could possibly even build out that community. Again, in listening, going back and watching some of the April 17th meeting in particular, there was a lot of discussion amongst council regarding the connectivity issues on the north end of town, and there were suggestions made of maybe doing some trails or some sidewalks and things of that nature. I think that by incorporating some of those ideas, it would resolve some of the connectivity issues from a walkability standpoint, which we've talked about. So I would like to reintroduce that because I think we're nearing the end of this whole thing. The name change specifically that was suggested to North Park, and then talk about the other.
And there's been another district that there was a name change suggested on. We got some feedback at the last come and go that the water district doesn't include Water Street, doesn't face the water, and it was one of the names possibly that was changing Water District to Ferry District, because that's where Ferry Park is. The ferry was it, and then you'd have ferry and river, and those things made more sense. So, council, does anybody oppose to North Park? As I say, Matt, why don't we just put that in, because we're not voting on anything, so that could just be the next draft.
I think there may be some concern.
Yes, I do.
Yes, same here.
It's always been North End. So if you want to change, I could accept North End Park.
North End Park.
Exactly what I was going to say. It's always been the North End. It's historically, authentically Bastrop North End. So adding park to it because of the amenities of parks would work, but it has to be North End, in my opinion.
It's always been North End because we called it North End. I grew up on the North End. This was North End, that was South End. South End has been changed. It's no longer called South End. I think it's now the Bluffs, if I'm looking at the right area. And we've always called it North End only because I actually call it Midtown. I tell people I live in Midtown Bastrop because I prefer a different name than North End. So it wasn't something that was historical, the Bastrop. That's just what it was called because we grew up saying we lived on the north end of town.
And that's historical.
So, go ahead.
That is very historical, and I've never heard of the Bluff. It's still called the South End. I live on the South End.
Now called the Bluff.
Well, I wasn't a resident of the North End or the South End, but that's how I referred to them, and historically that's what it's been called for years. And if we want to add the word park, that would be fine with me, but to take the end out of the North End would just be destructive, I think.
Mayor, since two of the folks engaged in the conversation vote, we're going to make that North End Park.
Yeah, we are.
And answer to your multi-mobility question, we have funding dedicated for sidewalks. We have intentionally not implemented that until this is adopted and we have street designs from which to work from. As soon as this plan is adopted, we will be in the North End Park implementing new sidewalks to aid in the connectivity. Because when council allocated this money, there was some specific concerns of a lady who happened to be pregnant that was hit. And she was in the North End because there were not sidewalks for her to walk. So that was the public safety demand that generated the red light camera money to be used for this. And we've been sitting on it because we want to ensure that all of the investment we make is in compliance to our own code. So as soon as this is adopted, then Matt Lewis will work with us and we will immediately start the construction of that. So you can anticipate that in January or so of the year, as soon as this is adopted, we will move to that. So there's money, but it's been intentional in us not spending it because I don't want to put in sidewalk only for somebody to go, well, it doesn't meet code, why'd y'all put it in there? So we're waiting until we can meet our own plan.
Thank you, and I will compromise on keeping that in.
I love it. I love it when a plan comes together. All right, council, it is 6:09. If I can have a motion to adjourn. And a second, and we are adjourned.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned.
Thank you again, Planning and Zoning.